Hey 12U. So yesterday we went through the endocrine system, again, the kind of the hormonal way of communicating, and today we're going to specifically talk about growth and metabolism. So that's the only thing we're going to talk about in the endocrine system. There was, and if you look in the content section, there's going to be stuff on like sex hormones and the regulation of, say, the menstrual cycle in females. But we're not going to touch upon that just due to time concerns. So we're going to focus more on the growth and metabolism. All right, so let's take a look at my lecture here, and we'll go through it. Okay, so that's the big thing we're going to be talking about today: growth, development, and metabolism. And they're really going to be looked at as separate things. We're going to look through growth first and then metabolism second. Okay, so just a reminder that our two different ways of communication in the body is our neuro and endocrine. I know I keep going over this. In our neuro system, remember that it's mostly electrical in the form of action potentials. However, in our neural system, we do use electrical and chemical signals. It's just mostly electrical, and then at the synaptic cleft, it'll sometimes be converted into a chemical and then back into an electrical, or if it's like a muscle, then it just kind of ends there. The endocrine uses only chemical messages. Okay? Now, that being said, an action potential, so an electrical message from the nervous system, could act on a gland, like the adrenals, to release a chemical, but the endocrine system only uses chemicals. It doesn't use action potentials. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is going to go through the glands and hormones involved in regulating growth and metabolic rate. So the glands that we're going to talk about today are mostly the pituitary, the hypothalamus, because it's under control, and the thyroid gland. Okay, those will be the ones that we really focus on. In terms of the hormones, we're going to focus on these three: TSH, HGH, and thyroxine, or T4. Okay, so during several stages of life, the body performs accelerated growth. In order to complete this, numerous cells must be informed simultaneously for a prolonged period of time that you're having a growth spurt. This is done by the endocrine system. So when we want to grow, as like say we're going through puberty, the message to grow can't be a quick message like the nervous system. You're going to be getting that message that you need to grow over a year or 2 years, and the message is constantly being sent to your body that you need to be growing. So a 2-year message can't be done through the nervous system. Otherwise, you'd be sending action potentials for 2 years straight. But when we use our endocrine system, we can basically just release a hormone or alter our hormone levels circulating in our blood, and we can keep these altered levels for a 2-year period, like through puberty, which causes us to do accelerated growth. Okay. Now, the other key thing is not only is this message a very long period of time, that everything needs to be informed simultaneously. Okay. If I'm going to be growing my legs, I need to make sure that my whole leg grows together. And what I mean by that is I can't have my quad and my hammy and then my ankle all growing at different rates. Okay? And that would happen if you were using the nervous system, because you need to be sending a signal to your ankle to grow, and then you got to send a signal to your leg, upper leg to grow, and then your lower leg to grow. Okay? And that would be constant signals, and they would never be simultaneously. But if I send basically a chemical down, okay, a chemical floods my entire leg, and that message is to everything. We need to start growing. So it allows us to grow simultaneously as opposed to different parts growing at different times, in which we would look probably really weird. Also, it wouldn't work very well. Okay, so the endocrine system really uses a two-part gland called the pituitary gland, and that's what we're really going to focus on when we're talking about growth, and we're really going to focus on growth first. Now, growth and metabolism are related because when you grow, you're going to have to increase your metabolic rate in order to get enough energy to grow. But we're going to kind of treat them a little bit separately here, and we're going to talk about the hormonal control of growth first, and then of metabolism. Okay? So first, just a little bit of background on the pituitary gland, because it's related to both. Okay, the pituitary gland is related to both. And where this pituitary gland is, well, it's just below the hypothalamus. So inside our brain, I'm going to show you a picture right here. Okay, so here's our brain, and here's our pituitary gland. Really, really, really small little gland here. Okay, it's just below the hypothalamus. We got our hypothalamus, and it comes down, and it looks like we have this pituitary gland, and it's two parts. Okay, we've got the anterior, okay, which is right here, and then we've got the posterior. And these nerve fibers are specific. Okay, notice they're only going to the posterior. I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so some key things about the pituitary gland. It's controlled by the hypothalamus. Okay, and how the hypothalamus controls it is by both action potentials. Okay, so we can do direct action potentials, or I can release hormones, and the hormones are going to be mostly for the anterior. Action potentials and hormones are for the posterior. Okay? So that's how the hypothalamus is going to activate this thing, is through both electrical stimulation to the posterior and chemical stimulation to both anterior and posterior through trophic hormones. And again, trophic hormones are just regulating hormones, hormones that cause the release of other hormones. Okay, so there's an anterior and posterior section. They release a ton of different hormones, but the posterior and anterior are very separate. If you look and notice that, say, over here, okay, this right here is the posterior, and it releases different hormones than the anterior. Okay, the anterior has different hormones, the posterior has different hormones. Okay, so they're very separate lobes. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about the posterior because it's a lot simpler and less hormones. So the posterior pituitary gland right here. Okay? It's considered part of the nervous system because it actually has neurons that go right into it. So it can be stimulated directly by the hypothalamus, and it can be stimulated quite quickly because it is through an action potential and not through a chemical message. So some key things: it does not produce any hormones. The posterior is incapable of producing hormones. It stores them, but it doesn't produce them. It only stores the hormones produced by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus will create some hormones, send it down to the posterior to store it. And then when it wants to be released, the hypothalamus will send a message to the posterior to release it. Okay. Some common hormones that don't really have much to do with growth and metabolism, so we won't be talking about them very much, is ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. Okay. And those are both released by the posterior. So the posterior, we're not going to talk about very much. It's required for regulation of water levels in the kidneys. We'll talk about it a little bit more when we do the excretory system, and for birth contractions via oxytocin, so to increase the contractions of the uterus. Now, what we're going to talk a lot more about is the anterior, because the anterior produces a lot more hormones, and it produces some hormones that we're going to specifically talk about, like TSH and growth hormone, or HGH. So the anterior pituitary, okay, if you notice, there's no nerves coming down in here. So in order to get this anterior pituitary to start releasing these hormones, the hypothalamus has got to release a hormone itself. Okay, so the hypothalamus releases a hormone, it goes into our capillaries. The capillaries run over the pituitary, and then the pituitary receives that trophic hormone and says, okay, what do you want me to release? That's the way the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary communicate. Right, and that's what I have here. It's controlled by trophic hormones from the hypothalamus. You should definitely know what a trophic hormone is. Okay? So the hypothalamus will either stimulate or inhibit the release of hormones via the anterior pituitary release of hormones from the anterior pituitary via trophic hormones. And these are all the different hormones that the anterior pituitary can release. I've asked you to already go through most of these, like FSH and LH and ACTH. We're going to focus on these today, TSH and GH, or human growth hormone. So let's first talk about growing, okay? And we're going to start now talking about hormonal control of growth. Okay, we'll talk about metabolism a little bit later, but today we're going to focus on growth. And the hormone that we're going to really focus on is human growth hormone. Now, this is sometimes just called GH, okay? Just growth hormone. We just kind of throw the human in there because we're talking about humans, but you know, the words are interchangeable: human growth hormone and growth hormone. So when we're talking about human growth hormone, the anterior pituitary gland produces and secretes this HGH, and it regulates and stimulates the growth and our metabolism. Okay, so it's going to stimulate you to grow when you release this hormone, as well as when you grow, you need to have quicker metabolic rates, so it increases your metabolism as well. Now, HGH is kind of has a two-part effect. The HGH itself can increase growth, but it can also act as a trophic hormone to release other hormones required for growth, like the growth factors released by the liver. So if we look at this figure over here, you get the message that you're going into puberty and you got to start growing. HGH will be released by the anterior pituitary, which will directly act on your skeleton muscles to increase muscle growth. It'll work on adipose tissue, which is fat tissue, to start breaking it down and converting it into energy for you to grow. It's going to start lengthening your bones. Okay? And those are direct effects of HGH. HGH, the hormone, directly affecting these effectors. Okay? Now, HGH can also go on to the liver. And when it goes on to the liver, it's acting as a trophic hormone. And what I mean by that is it's going to cause the release of other hormones called growth factors from the liver. Then the hormones from the liver then go on to act on the bone, the adipose tissue, and the skeleton. So the really human growth hormone acts directly by contacting muscle and tissues and bones, and then indirectly by causing the release of more growth factors from the liver, which will then go on to contact the bones, the fats, and our muscles. Right? Now, when we grow, HGH has got to stimulate some things in order to enable us to grow. Some of those is to increase protein synthesis. If you're going to grow, you're going to need more protein. Okay, you're going to need to build a new Golgi apparatus. You're going to need to build a new ribosomes. You're going to need to build a new lysosomes. Because when you grow, you're making more cells. Your cells aren't getting bigger. You're making more cells. And if you make a new cell, you're going to have all the stuff that's inside a cell, all those organelles, okay, all those channels. So we're going to need a lot of protein in order to do that. Okay? It also increases cell division in muscles and bones, and that makes sense. We're going to start dividing our cells, and the cells are going to be full of proteins. We need to have both of these increased. And then the breakdown of fat so that we can have more energy. So oftentimes when you go through puberty, you're going to actually start breaking down some of your adipose tissue and converting it into muscles or converting it into bones or converting it into energy. Okay, so one thing I want you to look up, this is something you need to do on your own, is I'd like you to research the effect of gigantism, dwarfism, and acromegaly. Okay, I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but I want you to know the cause and effect of these three conditions. It's related to HGH. Okay, make sure you look this up. Okay, and if you have any questions, you can ask me. Now let's turn our page over to metabolism. Okay, so what metabolism is really just kind of the speed that you process your macronutrients. Okay, it's often referred to as our metabolic rate. Now we have to alter our metabolic rate throughout growth and during times of excesses and shortage of foods. You don't keep your metabolic rate the same all day. Okay, if you ate breakfast this morning, you increased your metabolic rate. If you didn't, you slowed it down. Okay, so our metabolic rate isn't stagnant. Okay, it's very dynamic where we change it when we eat, we slow it down when we're fasting. During times of puberty, we're going to increase our metabolic rate. When you become really old and you're like a senior citizen, you're going to really slow down your metabolic rate. So it changes throughout the day, throughout your week, throughout your life. However, we do all contain a resting metabolic rate. Okay? And our resting metabolic rate is kind of responsible for our natural tendency to be either heavy set or normal weight or to be skinny. Okay? And our resting metabolic rate is really just how fast on a normal basis you're going to be processing macronutrients. Now the ups and downs and the resting metabolic rate are all controlled by the endocrine system. And in particular, we're going to talk about the pituitary and the thyroid. Okay? Now this gets a little bit more complicated than our growth because we're going to have a bunch of trophic hormones here. And trophic hormones are just hormones that release other hormones. Now, when we go over the control of metabolism, we're still going to be doing the anterior pituitary. Okay, before we did the posterior, but we didn't have any hormones coming from the posterior that we talked about. So we're going to be discussing the anterior pituitary, the same one that created HGH. Okay, is now produces another hormone. Okay, called TSH. Now remember that when the hypothalamus wants to communicate to the anterior pituitary, it can't do it via a nerve fiber. It's got to do it through a trophic hormone. So if you want to increase your metabolic rate, so the body says, okay, we just ate something, I need to increase my metabolic rate. The hypothalamus detects that you just ate something. That's our sensor. Okay? So it senses, okay, we ate something. It's also your control center and says, okay, we need to increase metabolic rate because I ate something. So it's both the sensor and the control center. Now it's going to start initiating a response. And the first thing it's going to do is got to tell the pituitary gland that you need to increase metabolic rate. So it's going to send a message to the anterior pituitary. Okay? And it does so via a hormone called TRH, okay? Thyroid releasing hormone. So the hypothalamus releases TRH. TRH circulates in our blood. And when it goes across the anterior pituitary interprets that message and says, oh, I've got to increase metabolic rate. So I'm going to release TSH. So TRH caused the anterior pituitary to release TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Well, thyroid stimulating hormone then goes into our bloodstream, okay, goes around in our blood, and when it flows over the thyroid has receptors for TSH. Okay? And the thyroid responds to this TSH by releasing a hormone that we're going to focus on called thyroxine or T4. And then T4 goes on to all of your muscles and all of your bones and causes, an increase of the metabolic rate, a faster cellular respiration. Okay. When T4 levels increase, that means that you're not using the T4 to increase your metabolic rate anymore. It's already fast enough. High levels of T4 will then go on and shut off the release of TSH at the anterior pituitary and also shut off the release of TRH by the hypothalamus. Okay. So let's talk about the thyroid first, and then we'll go into this process a little bit more in depth. So where is the thyroid? It's just below your larynx. Okay, you can feel it. If you feel your trachea and go all the way up, and you feel the left and right, you're going to feel these two glands. They're very small, and they're not really kind of sticking out too much, but you can kind of feel on your throat. Okay, don't push too hard. You don't want to strangle yourself. Okay, and it is controlled by the anterior pituitary, which is controlled by the hypothalamus. So really, the thyroid is indirectly controlled by the hypothalamus and directly controlled by the anterior pituitary. It's going to release a hormone called thyroxine, or T4, and that hormone that gets released is the one that causes the increase in metabolism. So here is the overall sequence. We already talked about it, but say you want to increase your metabolic rate. Your hypothalamus senses you need to increase your metabolic rate, creates a response. Okay, so it's the sensor and the controller. It's going to release TRH. The anterior pituitary has receptors for TRH. Not everywhere in your body is going to have receptors for TRH. Okay, your muscles aren't, your liver's not. Only your anterior pituitary has receptors for TRH and will make a response. Okay, so it responds to TRH by releasing TSH. Now, everywhere in your body doesn't have receptors for TSH. Only your thyroid gland does. So when your thyroid gland senses that you have high levels of TSH, it's going to release thyroid hormone, or T4, or thyroxine. Okay? So thyroxine is then going to go to your target cells and increase your metabolic rate. Okay? If your metabolic rate doesn't need to be increased anymore because it's already fast enough, you're going to have excess T4. That excess T4 is going to be picked up by the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus, which is going to sense that you have high levels of T4, and then it's going to shut down the whole process, shut down TRH and shut down TSH. Okay, now, there's a problem though. So there's a problem that happens where when you want to make T4, okay, you need to have iodine in order to make it. So when we go through this process, the hypothalamus says to the anterior pituitary, we need to increase metabolic rate. Anterior pituitary says to the thyroid gland, you got to increase metabolic rate. And the thyroid gland goes to make T4. Okay. Well, what if I don't have any iodine to make T4? If I don't have any T4, okay, these hormones are going to keep going. Your body is going to say, I need to increase my metabolic rate, but it's not happening because your T4 is not functional. Well, these hormones are going to go into hypodrive because TRH is going to say, well, I really need to increase my metabolic rate. It's not happening, so let's shoot some more TRH out. So the anterior pituitary says, wow, I have a ton of TRH. I need to produce a ton of TSH. Okay? So it's going to be constantly stimulating your thyroid gland to try and produce T4, but no T4 is being made. So this causes an overstimulation of your thyroid gland because it's constantly being exposed to by TSH. Okay? Well, this overstimulation causes it to expand and inflame, and what we get is called a goiter. And this is what a goiter is. It's basically the thyroid gland has become overstimulated by TSH, and it's caused it to massively inflame. So we don't want this to happen. I mean, I'm hoping it's not happening to any of you at home. Okay? And why it doesn't happen is the government purposely puts iodine in our diet. They understand that you need to have iodine or we're going to get people that are having goiters. So it floods iodine into our diet somehow. And if any of you know how iodine is flooded into our diet, I'll be really impressed. If you don't know, next time you get a salt package from a restaurant, look at the label on it and see whether it says salt or whether it says ionized salt. And I bet you it says ionized salt. And what that means is they're putting iodine into our salt packages so that we ingest iodine every day. Okay? Most people take salt in every day. And if you're taking salt in, especially from Canada, it most likely has iodine in it as well. They purposely put that iodine in order to prevent the onset of a goiter. Okay? So that's it for that. I'd like you to go through and explain the cause of hypothyroidism and hyperthyroidism, okay, along with dwarfism and giantism and the other ones. Take a look at the video on Bozeman Science or Mr. Anderson's on endocrine control of growth and endocrine control of metabolism. Okay, this is for if you have a textbook, you should do some questions on it. And then if you have any questions for me, make sure you email me, and we'll sort those out. Okay, we only have 2 days of classes left. We've got our excretory tomorrow, our excretory on Thursday. Then we're all done. Okay, I'll give you out basically an assignment that if you want to submit it, you can over the weekend. If you don't do it, it's no problem. It'll be a no mark, but at least it'll give you an idea as to what kind of questions I'm going to ask you on our last unit. Okay, so I mean, you got your updated marks yesterday. You got your test back, and you should be able to view all your tests with your answers.